city, classical logic will simply say, to confine ourselves to the reality of the conflict, that the city is not surrounded by the military, that is all. In the framework of intuitionistic logic, the conflict is not necessarily structured in such a rigid way. Each situation must be examined on a case-by-case basis. Naturally, we will maintain that a city cannot be occupied simultaneously by your troops and the enemies. But a city will be able to be called occupied if it is occupied, for example, by the troops of a neutral country. As a result, the fact of saying no city is occupied by our troops does not mean every city is occupied by the enemy. Consequently, the excluded middle is not always valid, which makes the so-called war situation more complex and possibly more open to subtle negotiation. With paraconsistent logic, you will admit that a city can be said to be occupied by our troops and also occupied by the enemy. And consequently, although it is occupied by our troops, in a certain way, it is not. After all, that was the case of Stalingrad for a long time during the last World War, so that the Soviet communiqué reporting we are occupying the city coexisted alongside the German ones reporting the same thing, without a formal contradiction between the two completely invalidating their simultaneous assertion. Nevertheless, you will maintain that the city could only be occupied, Stalingrad, for example, by either Soviets or Germans, or the two. In other words, the classical vision of the excluded middle, which amounts to asserting the idea that ultimately in a war there can only be two active sides, is maintained. What you had is that these two sides can construct a situation whose truth is not formalizable in the principle of non-contradiction. In fact, the potency of negation becomes increasingly weaker as we move from classicism to intuitionism and from intuitionism to paraconsistent logic. Why? Because the destructive power of negation diminishes. In classical logic, the negation of P excludes not only P itself, but also any other possibility concerning the content of proposition P. In intuitionistic logic, the negation of P excludes P itself, but not other possibilities that are actually located somewhere between P and not P. In paraconsistent logic, the negation of P excludes that type of space between P and not P, because you have the excluded middle, but not P itself. Thus, P is not eliminated by negation. P is not destroyed by negation when the negation is paraconsistent. Just as in Hegel's dialectic, P can be co-present alongside its own negation. In my ontology, a thing is a pure multiplicity without any qualitative determination. The general laws of a world are not laws of things themselves. They are laws of the relationships between things in a given world. I call the inscription of a pure multiplicity a thing. In the relational framework of a world, it's appearing in this world. So all laws, whether physical, biological, psychological, or juridical, are laws of appearing in the context of a singular world. In this context, a thing is not only a pure multiplicity, it also exists as an object in the world. This distinction between being, qua-being, and existence, pure multiplicity and appearing of a pure multiplicity in a world, which is also a distinction between a thing and an object, thing as a pure multiplicity, object as the pure multiplicity in a world, is fundamental. Clearly, the logic of being qua being, the ontological logic, is classical. This is because the composition of a pure multiplicity is extensional. What does extensional mean? That the difference between two multiplicities is defined point by point. Two multiplicities are different if and only if there is some element of one multiplicity that is not an element of the other. So we immediately have the two classical principles. First, we define P as a multiplicity, or a set, if you want. Then we define not P as the set of all elements which do not belong to P. So P, affirmation of P is a multiplicity, a thing, and not P is all things which are not in P. The result is that, by extensionality, not P is absolutely different from P, because there is nothing in common between P and not P. P and not P have nothing in common. It is thus impossible to find anything that is simultaneously in P and in not P. So the principle of non-contradiction is true, because we cannot find something which is simultaneously P and not P. Next, every element that is not in P is not P by definition of not P. Not P is the multiplicity of all what is not in P. So there is no third possibility. Something is always either in P or in not P. So the principle of the excluded middle is true. So if you are the idea that we can think of an anonymous thing, if you want, a thing as purely a thing, as a multiplicity, we have as a consequence of this affirmation that the logical context of ontology is a classical one, with the two Aristotelian principles, the principle of non-contradiction and the principle of the excluded mid. But now, appearing and existence present a completely different case.